True peace comes not from deflecting disrespect, but from wisely transforming it into compassion for its source. Exhausted, the contemporary philosopher and practitioner of Stoicism, Kaelen, closed his laptop. The bluish light from the screen cast a ghostly glow on his face, accentuating the fatigue in his eyes. The video conference had been a massacre. Not a massacre of bodies, but of spirit, a barrage of microaggressions and veiled disdain, all coming from a single source: his senior colleague, Marcus. Marcus, a man whose ambition was as vast as his insecurity, saw Kaelen as a threat. Kaelen's quiet competence, his refusal to participate in corporate gossip, and his unshakable serenity seemed to irritate Marcus on a fundamental level. That afternoon, the humiliation had been public. In front of the entire leadership team, Marcus had dismantled Kaelen's proposal, not with logic or data, but with sarcasm and condescension. He referred to Kaelen's project as a cute academic exercise, idealistic, but disconnected from reality. And the lowest blow, the kind of thing you'd expect from someone who spent more time with books than with balance sheets. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the pity of others and Marcus's smug triumph. The initial adrenaline, the heat of shame that had risen up Kaelen's neck, had already dissipated. Now, in the silence of his home office, the emotional aftermath threatened to take over. The mind, like a wounded animal, wanted to lash out. It wanted to draft a scathing email, to list Marcus's logical fallacies, to expose his sabotage to the Sysmeister CEO. It wanted the taste of revenge, the satisfaction of seeing Marcus diminished as he had been. Kaelen stood up and walked to the window. The city stretched out below, a sea of lights indifferent to his small drama. He took a deep breath, the cool night air filling his lungs. It was here, in this exact moment of stillness after the storm, that the practice began. Stoicism wasn't about suppressing emotions. It was about analyzing them, dissecting their origin, and responding to them with virtue. His first thought went to Epictetus, the slave who became a philosopher. Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them. Kaelen closed his eyes and repeated the phrase to himself, not as an empty mantra, but as a surgical tool. What was the event? Marcus spoke a series of words. He used a specific tone of voice. The other team members remained silent. The end. These were the raw facts, what nature had presented to him. And what was the judgment? I was humiliated. My worth was questioned. My career has been harmed. Marcus disrespected me. This was the narrative his mind had constructed around the facts. It was this narrative, not Marcus's words, that was the source of his pain. The story was the poison, not the event. He opened his eyes. The city was still there, impassive. He needed to apply the dichotomy of control, the central pillar of his philosophy. What, in this situation, was under his control? His judgments, his impulses, his desires and aversions. His own virtue. What was not under his control? Marcus's opinions, the reactions of his other colleagues, Kaelen's reputation in their eyes. The final decision on his project, not to focus on what he could not control, was the path to frustration and anxiety. It was like trying to command the wind. To focus on what he could control was the path to tranquility and agency. The question, therefore, was not, how can I make Marcus respect me? But rather, how can I respond to this situation virtuously, regardless of Marcus's respect? Kaelen moved away from the window and went to his bookshelf, his fingers tracing the spines of his silent mentors. Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus. He picked up Meditations. He didn't need to open it. The words were already etched into his mind. He imagined Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the world, dealing with treacherous generals, fawning politicians, and the sheer ineptitude of the court. Begin the morning by saying to yourself, I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial, the emperor-philosopher wrote. All these things happen to them by reason of their ignorance of what is good and evil. Kaelen thought of Marcus. What motivated him? Fear, insecurity, a desperate need to assert his dominance. Marcus didn't act out of a pure, calculated malice, but from a fundamental ignorance of what was truly good. He believed that power, status, and the humiliation of a rival would bring him happiness. He was, in essence, sick. His soul was disordered. Would it be reasonable to hate a man for having a fever? Or for having blurred vision? Marcus Aurelius's answer was clear, no. The appropriate response was pity, understanding, and, above all, the refusal to let their sickness infect you. Marcus's disrespect was not about Kaelen. It was a reflection of Marcus's own character. The attempted humiliation was like an arrow, shot by a blind archer. If the arrow hit him, it would be unfortunate. But to allow the poison of anger and resentment to spread from the wound, that would be a choice. A foolish choice. Kaelen began to pace the room, the philosophical process, unfolding like a map in his mind. He had dissected the event, applied the dichotomy, and considered the source of the insult. Now, he needed to decide on a virtuous response. Revenge was out of the question. Revenge would admit that he had been wounded and would place his emotional well-being in Marcus's hands. It would be saying, your opinion has so much power that it has forced me to abandon my principles to attack you back. It would be a defeat. Resentful silence was also a form of defeat. It would allow bitterness to fester. It would be a slow poison, corroding his own tranquility. So, what was the wise, just, and courageous response? Wisdom demanded that he see the situation clearly, without the fog of emotion. His proposal was attacked. The response should focus on the proposal, not the attack. Justice demanded that he act fairly, not only toward Marcus, but toward himself and the company. To abandon a good project because of a bruised ego would be an injustice to the project's potential and to the trust the company placed in him. Courage demanded that he not shrink away, not hide, to face the situation, not the man. Temperance demanded moderation in his response. No anger, no sarcasm, no passive aggression. Just calm, reason, and focus. Kaelen returned to his desk. He would not draft an email to the CEO exposing Marcus. Instead, he began writing a new document. The title was Risk Analysis and Mitigation Strategies for Project X, based on leadership meeting feedback. He addressed each of Marcus's sarcastic points, not as insults, but as if they were genuine concerns raised by a well-intentioned colleague. Where Marcus had called it a cute academic exercise, Kaelen wrote, Discussion Point 1, Perception of theoretical viability versus practical application. Action. Develop a Phase 1 prototype with clear success metrics and a projected ROI to demonstrate tangible value within 90 days. Where Marcus had mocked it as idealistic, Kaelen wrote, Discussion. Point 2. Alignment with current market realities. Action. Attach 3 case studies of competitors who implemented similar strategies, highlighting both their successes and challenges, and how our plan learns from both. For the lowest blow, about spending more time with books than with balance sheets, Kaelen created a section titled Detailed Financial Analysis, where he broke down the costs, revenue projections, and break-even point with a rigor that was irrefutable. He turned the insult into an opportunity to demonstrate even greater proficiency. He wasn't doing this to prove Marcus wrong. That would be a reactive motivation. He was doing this because it was the right and virtuous thing to do. He was acting in his domain, the domain of reason and excellence. The work itself would become the answer. An answer that didn't scream, but demonstrated. When he finished, hours later, Kaelen felt not the feverish triumph of revenge, but the clean, solid satisfaction of duty fulfilled. He emailed the document to the entire leadership group, including Marcus. The subject line was neutral. Follow-up document on Project X proposal. In the body of the email, he made no reference to the previous meeting. He simply wrote, "Thank you all for the valuable discussion and feedback today. I've attached a follow-up document that addresses some of the key points raised and outlines practical next steps for evaluation. I welcome any further insight." Short. Professional. Impenetrable. He leaned back. The battle had not been won in the email or the meeting room. The battle was won in the silence of his office, in the space of a few inches between stimulus and response. He had refused the role Marcus had offered him, that of the victim, the humiliated rival. Instead, he chose his own role, that of the professional, the philosopher, the man who governs himself. Marcus's respect was irrelevant. What Kaelen had earned that night was something infinitely more valuable: his own respect. He had kept his inner citadel safe from the external chaos. The next day, the atmosphere in the virtual office was different. A few colleagues sent private messages to Kaelen, praising the thoroughness of the follow-up document. The CEO replied to the group email with a simple, "Excellent initiative, Kaelen. Let's discuss this in our one-on-one." Marcus was silent. In the next group video conference, Marcus's name did not appear on the list of attendees. An hour later, an email from Human Resources landed in everyone's inbox. It announced, in standard corporate jargon, that Marcus was no longer with the company, effective immediately. Kaelen read the email without feeling joy or relief. Marcus's departure was not a victory. It was just another external event, another indifferent move of the pieces on life's chessboard. Cause and effect were complex. Perhaps their confrontation had been the last straw. Perhaps other factors were at play. It didn't matter. To focus on it would be to distract from the real work. He closed the email and looked at his to-do list. The work on his proposal continued. The practice continued. For a moment, a sense of peace enveloped him. He had faced disrespect, not with anger, but with reason. He had used the insult as raw material to forge a virtuous action. He had protected his tranquility. It was then that his phone rang. It was an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A cold, controlled voice, a voice he hadn't heard in a decade, spoke from the other end of the line. It was his father, a man whose silent disapproval had been the architecture of his childhood, a man from whom he had distanced himself to find his own way. "Kaelen," the voice said, devoid of any warmth, "your mother is sick, very sick. You need to come home." The city outside, with its impersonal lights, suddenly seemed much darker. The challenge from Marcus was a sparring exercise. The battle to come, the battle against the ghosts of family, old pain, and unspoken expectations, would be the real war. He had learned to deflect the arrows of a stranger. But could he keep his inner citadel safe from the siege that would come from within his own heart? The philosophy had prepared him for the boardroom, but was he prepared for the living room of his childhood? The practice, he realized, never ended. It only deepened. The call ended, but the silence that followed brought no peace. It was a vacuum, heavy and dense, filled with the echo of his father's voice, a voice that was less a sound and more a barometric pressure, capable of changing the climate of his soul. The serenity Kaelen had so painstakingly won the night before now seemed fragile, a thin sheet of ice over a dark and turbulent ocean of personal history. Philosophy had armed him for the battlefield of logic and reason, but this was different. This was a return to the forge where his first scars were shaped. He did not hesitate. The action was clear, a duty dictated by pietas, the sacred duty to family, country, and the gods that the Romans held so dear. He booked the first flight. to his childhood city, a place he had deliberately left behind, but which, it seemed, had never left him. The suitcase was packed with a mechanical, almost robotic efficiency. Shirts, pants, a toiletry kit, and lastly, a small pocket-sized edition of Epictetus's Enchiridion. It was a talisman, a reminder of the arsenal he carried within. The plane journey was a purgatory suspended in time. Below, the clouds formed a serene landscape, a false floor hiding the complexity of the world. Kaelen didn't try to distract himself with movies or music. He engaged in the practice of premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. He did it not with morbid pleasure, but with the precision of a strategist mapping enemy terrain. He visualized the arrival, the small, familiar airport, the humid, heavy air of his homeland. He imagined himself renting a car and driving through the streets that haunted his memories, each corner a potential trigger for an emotion he thought he had overcome. He visualized the house, not as a home, but as a museum of past resentments, and, most importantly, he visualized his father, Elias. He imagined the reluctant handshake, the gaze that would appraise him from head to toe in a second, finding invisible flaws. He heard in his mind the cutting questions disguised as concern. That job of yours in the big city, does it pay the bills? Still wasting time with those old books? He felt the old sting of inadequacy, the powerless anger of a boy who could never win the approval of the man who mattered most by premeditating these evils. Kaelen was not surrendering to them. He was inoculating himself. For each scenario, he practiced his response. Not the verbal response, but the internal one. When his father judges him, he will remember. His opinion belongs to him. It is a product of his own mind, his own history. It has no power over my inner peace unless I grant it. When the sadness for his mother's illness assails him, he will allow himself to feel the pain of love, but not despair. Sickness and death are part of nature. To love something is to accept that it is transient. My duty is not to prevent the inevitable, but to act with love and virtue in the time I am given. The plane landed with a jolt, bringing him back to reality. The practice was over. The test was about to begin. The house was exactly as he remembered it, immaculately clean and terribly quiet. The smell was the same, a mixture of floor wax and something indefinable, the scent of stagnant time. Elias opened the door before Kaelen could knock. He was older, his hair thinner, his shoulders a little more stooped, but his eyes still possessed the same piercing intensity. There was no hug, just a nod. "You took your time," Elias said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement. A fact, the one loaded with the weight of 1,000 other unspoken statements over the years. "It was the earliest flight I could get," Kaelen replied, his voice calm and level. He refused to take the bait, to start justifying himself. It was a fact, nothing more. "She's in the bedroom. The doctor was here this morning." Elias turned and walked inside, expecting Kaelen to follow. Kaelen paused at the door for a moment, feeling the weight of the house's atmosphere. Every object, every photograph on the wall was an anchor to the past. He saw a picture of himself at 10, holding a science fair trophy, smiling at the camera. Beside him, Elias looked at him, unsmiling. Kaelen's inner citadel trembled for an instant. He took a breath. "Control your judgment," he whispered to himself. "It's just a picture. The story you tell about it is yours." He stepped inside and followed his father. His mother, Helena, was lying in bed, pale and visibly more fragile than on his last visit a year before. But her eyes lit up when she saw Kaelen. "My son," she whispered, her voice weak. Kaelen knelt by the bed and took her hand. It was warm and dry. He said nothing for a moment, just allowing the silent connection to speak. He focused entirely on her presence. He was not a philosopher in that moment, nor a successful professional. He was just a son, present for his mother. It was the virtuous act required by the situation. "I'm here, Mom," he said finally. Elias watched from the doorway, a grim sentinel. "Don't tire her out," he said. Later, in the kitchen, as Kaelen made some tea, Elias began his subtle offensive. "The doctor says it's her heart. Stress." He looked at Kaelen. "She always worried too much about you. Far away, alone in that city." Kaelen put the kettle on to boil. The old anger simmered inside him. The insinuation was clear. Her worry was his fault. His life choice had contributed to this. He felt the heat rise in his face. But then, the voice of Epictetus echoed in his mind. "Remember that it is not he who reviles you or strikes you who insults you, but your opinion that these things are insulting." He turned, holding 2 cups. He looked at his father, not as an adversary, but as an object of study. He saw a man ruled by fear. Fear of losing his wife, fear of his own mortality, fear of emotions he could not control. His criticism of Kaelen wasn't an attack. It was a flawed defense mechanism, a deflection of his own pain. "I'm worried about her too," Kaelen said, his voice soft, devoid of any defensive tone. "What exactly did the doctor recommend?" The response disarmed Elias. He had expected an argument, a defense, the reenactment of the same drama they had been performing for 30 years. Kaelen's calm, his practical focus, left him without a script. "Rest. Medication," Elias stammered, looking momentarily lost. In the days that followed, Kaelen established a routine. He cared for his mother. He cooked. He cleaned. He spoke with the doctors. He acted. He focused on his circle of control. With his father, he was consistently calm and respectful, but without being subservient. He refused to be drawn into arguments about the past or debates about his life choices. When Elias tried, Kaelen would gently redirect the conversation back to the present, to Helena's needs. He was becoming a rock in the midst of the home's emotional current. His peace was not passive. It was an active force that slowly began to change the dynamic around him. One evening, Kaelen was sitting on the back porch, reading his Enchiridion in the dim light. Elias came out and sat in the other chair, something he rarely did. They sat in silence for several minutes. "Those books," Elias began, and Kaelen braced himself. "All that philosophy of yours, what does it say about ... this?" He gestured vaguely toward the house, the situation, life. Kaelen marked his page. He didn't offer a quote or a lesson. He offered a piece of himself. "It says there are things we can control and things we can't," Kaelen said. "We can't control sickness. We can't control what others think. We can't control the past. We can only control how we choose to respond to it all, with courage, with justice, and with calm." Elias was silent for a long time, staring into the darkness of the yard. Kaelen didn't try to fill the silence. He simply waited. Finally, Elias spoke, his voice so low Kaelen almost didn't hear it. "Your mother, she keeps everything in boxes. In the attic. Your things, my things. She never throws anything away." He stood up abruptly. "It's getting cold." And he went inside. Kaelen remained on the porch, the night air now charged with a new possibility. His father's comment wasn't an apology, nor a breakthrough, but it was a crack. A small fissure in the armor he had worn his entire life. An indirect admission of a shared past of stored-up pain. He realized his Stoic challenge had shifted. It was no longer about just enduring his father or deflecting his attacks. Philosophy now asked something much harder of him. It asked him to understand. It asked him to look into the attic of his family's history, not with fear or anger, but with the courage of an archaeologist, ready to uncover the truth about the man behind the armor, and, in the process, the truth about himself. The battle for tranquility had transformed into a quest for empathy, and that was a journey for which no book could fully prepare him. Elias's statement hung in the cool night air, a fragile and unexpected bridge across the chasm of silence that separated them. It wasn't an invitation, but it wasn't a closed door either. It was a piece of information, raw and unadorned. But for Kaelen, trained to find meaning in the subtext of existence, it was a map. The attic, the physical repository of the family's memory, the place where the past was not dead, not even past. It was just in storage. The next morning, a sense of purpose moved Kaelen. His mother was stable, sleeping under the effect of her medication. Elias was in the yard, busying himself with some futility, a way to channel his anxiety into physical labor. The house was quiet. It was time. Philosophy demanded not just passive contemplation, but virtuous action, and courage was one of the cardinal virtues. Courage to face an enemy, courage to endure pain, and perhaps the hardest of all, courage to open dusty boxes in an attic. The attic ladder was at the end of the upstairs hallway, hidden behind a discreet door. Pulling the cord made the folding ladder descend with a long, reluctant groan, as if protesting being disturbed. The air that drifted down with it was thick and still, with the unmistakable scent of old paper, dry wood, and time. Kaelen ascended, each step a deeper move into the past. Light from a small dormer window illuminated a universe of dancing dust motes. The attic was not chaotic. True to his mother's nature, everything was organized in cardboard boxes of various sizes, each with a label written in her elegant, precise cursive. Kaelen School, grades 1 to 5. Kaelen Toys. Winter clothes. He moved past these boxes, feeling a tug of nostalgia, an emotion he observed with the detachment of a scientist. He acknowledged the feeling, named it, but did not allow it to overwhelm him. His purpose was elsewhere. He was looking for something that wasn't his dot in a darker corner. Behind a stack of old furniture covered by a sheet, he found what he was looking for. A series of different older boxes, his mother's handwriting looking slightly less firm. One of them simply read, ELIS. His heart beat a little faster. This felt like a transgression, an invasion. But the voice of Stoic reason intervened. What is the intention? It was not to snoop out of malice, but to seek understanding. It was an act of justice, to try to see the whole man. With steady hands, he pulled the box into the center of the attic, under the beam of light. As he lifted the lid, the smell of mothballs and history intensified. On top lay a precisely folded military uniform. Kaelen knew his father had served in the army as a young man, but Elias never spoke of it. Tucked inside the uniform was a service medal, cold and heavy in his palm. An object that represented a chapter of his father's life completely unknown to him. Beneath the uniform were books, not the practical engineering manuals that crowded Elias's shelves in the living room, but volumes of poetry and philosophy. Kaelen flipped through one. The margins were filled with notes, questions, and exclamations written in an impetuous, youthful hand. It was the handwriting of a man who grappled with big ideas, who marveled at the beauty and complexity of the world. A man Kaelen had never met. And then, at the bottom of the box, he found a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were letters from his grandfather, Elias's father. Kaelen sat on the dusty floor and began to read. The words were sharp, efficient, and devoid of any warmth. They were a series of orders and expectations. Your allowance for this month is enclosed. I expect your performance in mathematics to improve. Poetry is a pastime for the idle. Focus on your engineering studies. It is a respectable future. Your mother and I are disappointed by your last letter. Full of idealistic notions. Be a man. Be practical. Letter after letter painted the same desolate portrait, a bright, sensitive boy being systematically molded, or rather, crushed into the practical, hard image of his own father. The silent disapproval Kaelen had suffered his whole life was not Elias's invention. It was an inheritance, a toxic family tradition, passed from father to son like a genetic disease. Kaelen held the letters, their weight seeming immense. He applied what Marcus Aurelius called the view from above. He imagined himself floating above the attic, looking down. He saw not just himself and the letters. He saw his father as a young boy, reading those same words, feeling the same sting of inadequacy. He saw his grandfather, perhaps himself a product of an equally cold father. He saw the chain of pain, the current of men unable to express love because perhaps they had never received it unconditionally. The anger Kaelen held for his father didn't disappear completely, but it transformed. It was diluted into something far vaster and more complex: compassion. Not a condescending pity, but a tragic understanding. His father wasn't the architect of his pain. He was merely the most recent carrier. He found one last thing in the box: a single black and white photograph. In it, a 20-something Elias stood arm in arm with two other young men, all of them laughing openly at the camera. In the background, a sign read, Federal University. Elias looked light, happy, a person who existed before the weight of the world, before his father's inheritance, settled permanently on his shoulders. Kaelen descended from the attic, no longer a wounded son, but a historian, a philosopher who had just discovered a crucial piece of evidence. He found his father in the kitchen, staring out the window at the rain that had begun to fall. He said nothing. He just placed the photograph on the kitchen table, next to Elias's hand. Elias looked at the photo. His entire body stiffened. His shoulders, which seemed permanently hunched under an invisible weight, went ramrod straight. He looked from the photo to Kaelen, his eyes a storm of emotions he didn't know how to name. Anger, shame, surprise. Kaelen didn't flinch. He met his father's gaze, not with defiance, but with a quiet calm. "I was in the attic," Kaelen said, his voice soft. "Mom kept everything. You look happy here, Dad." He asked no questions. He made no accusations. He just presented a fact, an observation, an offering. He had done his part, the virtuous act of opening a door. Whether Elias would walk through it was outside of his control. Elias picked up the photo. His hand, usually so steady, trembled slightly. He didn't say a word. He turned and, with the photograph in hand, walked toward his bedroom. Closing the door softly behind him, Kaelen stood alone in the kitchen, the sound of the rain filling the silence. There was no resolution, no hugs, no confessions. But something fundamental had shifted. He had reached across time, not to the father who had wounded him, but to the young man in the photograph, the man his father might have been. Elias's bedroom. Door remained closed, but for the first time, Kaelen didn't feel like it was a barrier. It felt more like a sanctuary, a place where a tired old man might, perhaps, be grieving for the young man he was forced to leave behind. The quest for understanding was over. The long, patient task of building a bridge, however, was just beginning. The sound of the rain had subsided, turning into a constant whisper against the window pane. The day's drama had dissolved into the quiet of the night. Kaelen sat in an armchair. In his mother's room, Helena was sleeping, her breathing calmer and more regular than in the previous days. The door to Elias's room, down the hall, remained closed. He had not emerged since entering with the photograph in that silence. The journey of the past few weeks unfolded in Kaelen's mind, not as a series of events, but as the postulates and proofs of a complex philosophical theorem. It all began with a simple question: how to respond intelligently to someone who doesn't respect you. The initial answer, forged in the corporate battle with Marcus, now seemed like a lesson from elementary school. Marcus, with his disdain and sarcasm, was a problem of logic, an external stimulus that required the application of the dichotomy of control. His words were external, his motives were external, and the only virtue response was to focus on the internal, the excellence of the work, the calmness of the soul, the refusal to surrender one's own peace. It was a successful exercise, but it was only an exercise. Life, in its relentless wisdom, then presented him with the final exam. His father was not Marcus. The disrespect of a colleague was a bee sting. The disapproval of a father was the very air one breathed in childhood, a slow poison that shaped the structure of one's bones. Kaelen came home armed with Stoicism as a shield, his inner citadel reinforced against the attacks he had premeditated. He was prepared to deflect the arrows, to remain unmoved, to endure. And herein lay the great revelation of the journey, the philosophical turning point. The goal of the sage is not merely to endure the world. It is not to build a fortress so impenetrable that nothing can touch it. That is only the first stage, the tempering of the steel. True wisdom, Kaelen now understood, lies not in building walls, but in realizing that there is nothing fundamentally external to defend against. The ascent to the attic was the ascent to a higher plane of understanding. Reading his grandfather's letters, Kaelen saw not just the origin of his father's hardness. He saw himself in the stream of causality. Philosophy suddenly expanded beyond his own mind. He applied the dichotomy of control not just to himself, but through empathy to his father. What was in Elias's control as a boy? Not the cold words of his own father, not the crushing expectations. Elias's personality, his inability to express affection, was not a freely chosen moral failing. It was a scar. It was the result of his own lost battles against things that were outside his control. The intelligent response to someone who doesn't respect you, therefore, evolved dramatically. First, it was deflection, recognizing that the insult is an external opinion, not a fact, and refusing to validate it. Protecting one's own tranquility. Then, it became analysis, examining the source of the disrespect, not with anger, but with the curiosity of a physician. Seeing the aggressor not as an enemy, but as someone acting from ignorance of what is good, driven by fear, insecurity, or pain. But the final, deepest stage was transmutation. It was Stoic alchemy. It was taking the base metal of disrespect and, through the heat of empathy and understanding, turning it into gold. Gold not in the form of earned respect, for that remains external and valueless, but gold in the form of inner wisdom. By understanding the source of his father's pain, Elias's disapproval ceased to be a personal attack on Kaelen. It transmuted into a tragic symptom of Elias's own life. Kaelen's pain then dissolved into compassion. He glanced through the open door and saw his father asleep in an armchair in his own room, the black and white photograph resting on his chest. Kaelen's inner citadel was no longer under siege, because he had realized that the enemy out there was, in many ways, a prisoner in his own fortress. The summary of it all was not an instruction manual, but a living truth. The universe constantly presents us with disrespect, hardship, and pain. The fundamental question of philosophy is not how to avoid these things, but how to use them. They are the raw material of virtue. Marcus's insult was the kindling for the fire of professional excellence. His mother's illness was the catalyst for filial duty, and the lifetime of his father's disapproval became the key to empathy, the bridge to understanding that every soul carries its own history of invisible battles. The final and most intelligent response to someone who doesn't respect you is not a sentence, a silence, or an act of revenge. It is an internal reorientation so complete that the very question of respect becomes secondary. It is the attainment of inner freedom, where self-worth depends not on the applause or approval of others, but is forged in the fire of virtuous action and tempered in the compassionate understanding of human fallibility. It is to look upon the world with all its beauty and brutality, and to accept your role in it, not as a victim of circumstance, but as an agent of reason, a student of human nature, and a craftsman of your own soul. The respect he had sought would not come from his father or his colleagues. He found it there in the quiet of the room, in the peace that came not from the absence of conflict, but from the profound understanding of its nature. And that peace, he knew, was the only victory that mattered